There's a lot of research going on in populism, particularly in the nexus the US and Europe. So, what is missing in academia when it comes to studying populism?
Well, the answer to that question of what is missing in the study of populism, that's been changing a lot recently, because since 2016, with all of the increased interest in populism as a result of the election of Donald Trump and the Brexit referendum, there's just been an explosion of scholarly research on this and interest in the public and among policymakers. Funding opportunities have opened up in so many places, and because of that, a lot of things are being covered now that weren't before. So there are a lot of initiatives to measure populism. There's already a fair understanding of how to define populism. Not that there's just one way, but that there's a sort of limited set of ways of defining it, and the boundaries are pretty clear across each of those definitions. I think there's a lot more attention being paid now to what causes populism, and that was something that, oddly enough, was a little absent for a while. And now also, as populists are entering government in countries where they haven't been in government for a while, there's attention to the consequences of populism for things like public policy or democratic institutions. I think what's still lacking, and what we're just starting to do, is to kind of flip that research on its head and say, I don't just want to understand what causes populism, but recognizing that it does have some negative consequences and maybe some positive ones. I want to understand better how to mitigate that, to not think about what could I do to cause more populism, but what could I do to maybe cause less of it or reshape the direction it goes. And so that's why I like to think about mitigating populism. That fits into a larger study of democratic erosion and how we turn that around. So I don't just want to understand why democracy falls apart, but I want to understand how to strengthen it. And ironically, I think that positive focus is still missing from a lot of research. And the populism scholars themselves, I think, could give more attention now to, how do we go about dealing with this or solving it. In fact, a lot of the funding sources now emphasize things like policy relevance. And I don't think you can think about policy relevance without thinking about how you want to resolve or mitigate this. But the political scientists and academics in the social sciences generally are not used to doing things with policy relevance. We produce things for academic journals, for academic presses, and when we do that, we're very narrowly focused on what causes this thing that I am interested in, and we solve that, and then we move on to the next question. And don't stop to think, well, yeah, but what use is that answer to the public? And was that really why I wanted to study this in the first place? I mean, was it just curiosity, or was it because I care about some, maybe some normative issues? How do I make the world a better place? How do I make democracy work better? And so it isn't always natural. It isn't always, the incentives aren't always there for us as social scientists to study those things. So I am hopeful that as funding grows from many different private foundations and government agencies, that funding will force scholars to think more practically about what can we do to solve or to mitigate this. Yeah, so are there others we need to look at or talk to besides journalists and policymakers to make the study of populism better? That's a pretty inclusive list if we talk about journalists and policymakers and academics trying to work together. And I know I've been able to have some of those experiences already, as I was involved in a project where we worked with The Guardian, the UK daily, to take our research and bring it to a global audience. And that was a fantastic experience for us, because it helped us think more about what the public would care about, what we kind of wanted the public to know about from what we had done, so that gave us a great way of stopping and reflecting on our own research. But I think that the other people we need to talk to or think about are just fellow citizens of our countries. I mean, maybe this will sound populist for me to say it this way, but I think there's a lot to be said for just getting out and talking with, maybe in a structured way through field research, maybe in a more informal way through conversations with taxi drivers and members of your own family and your neighbors and just people you meet, but to try to understand from their own perspective why they might be voting for a populist, what's going through their minds. And you know, as scholars, that's something that we've actually been trained to do. A lot of us have experience in field work. But with populism, I think it can be a little off-putting because we may have we may have taken a side in that partisan conflict, and we may not like the populist, or we may not trust or value our fellow citizens who support that populist. But I think unless we're willing to have that conversation and try to bridge that divide a little bit, that it's going to be pretty hard for us to go out preaching things like civil discourse and dialogue as ways of mitigating populism if we ourselves don't practice that. So I think that's an important thing for us to do, another party that we should bring into that conversation.
What should researchers look at when trying to mitigate the effects of populism?
I think this is something that happens at multiple levels. So there's something to be said for studying interpersonal communication, how two members of a family or two neighbors talk to each other in a conversation. That's a place where populism happens and where it can polarize people. But then we also have to think at maybe the more meso level, well, what about strategies for parties or civil society organizations? What can they do? But then we also have to think about the role that governments play and international organizations. So these all play a role in this process of trying to mitigate populism and think about what causes it and how we can address those causes. And I don't think any one person's project could focus on one piece of that. But ultimately, we want to be able to cover all of those areas because I think they all matter.